مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. نحن في منتصف فصل الصيف، حين يبدأ الحر الشديد في واشنطن يمثل شبه جزيرة العربية، ويبدأ كثير من الناس في الإيمان بظاهرة الاغترار العالمي. غادر الرئيس والكونغرس ومعظم واشنطن البلد في طريقهم إلى الشاطئ، الجبال أو أي مكان. لم تختف مشكلات دولتنا، وإنما اختفى فقط الأشخاص المنتخبين لحلها. إذن هذه فرصة مثالية لنعود فنلقي نظرة على الضيوف الرائعين الذين شرفنا بصحبتهم في برنامج داخل واشنطن على مدار العام الفائت. ضموا جمهوريين وديمقراطيين، صحفيين وسفراء، مسؤولين حاليين وسابقين من مختلف الفروع التنفيذية والتشريعية للحكومة. وفيما يلي بعض من أهم ما جاء على ألسنتي. I want to ask you just about Hillary as a women's candidate. Now, there was enormous enthusiasm in 2008, and I think everybody remembers the glass ceiling and cracking the glass ceiling. Does that enthusiasm carry over 8 years later, or has America, I don't want to say gotten beyond it, but is it less of a driver of enthusiasm?
It was 18 million votes she got, and it was 18 million cracks in the glass ceiling. And you had a lot of women who were very disappointed, who thought, you know, this was their only chance to see a woman elected in their lifetime. It's not a great bench of necessarily of women who are considered a stepping stone away from a candidacy. I think, you know, 8 years later, I don't think you have the same level of excitement, at least not now. And the fact that she's a woman is not enough to vault her across the finish line. But I think in 2008, she really shied away from presenting herself as an historic candidacy. She let Barack Obama do that. And so I think you are going to get more of a sense of history when she does step forward and announce her candidacy this time. I think she's going to lead with the fact that she's a woman. I think she stayed away from that in 2008. You know, she thought first commander-in-chief, you didn't want to appear like a woman, you wanted to appear more like what people have been used to in the past. You didn't want to call attention to the fact that she was a woman. She didn't do that really until she bowed out of the race. Mm-hmm. So I think she will do a little bit more of that, but certainly that's not enough to carry her presidency. This is about the economy and whether she can sort of restore this country's faith in itself.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So there's already a tension that has begun to emerge. At what point does Hillary Clinton begin to separate herself from the man who appointed her Secretary of State?
She's already beginning to do that, and the book is an example of that. And one of the things she highlights in the book, and she keeps saying, I wasn't trying to highlight it, I had to call the White House to apologize, but in 2012, she led a group of very important members of the administration, including the head of the CIA and the head of the Defense Department, to appeal to the President Obama to provide weapons to the so-called moderates in Syria. She thought that was an important thing to do at that time. And some people now looking in retrospect who in fact thought that was the right thing to do then, and the fact that Obama hadn't done that has led, in fact, in part to ISIS gaining so much momentum, think that she might be a little bit too aggressive because of that one example. But in the case of Libya, for example, did she make an argument for the United States to stay behind and not cut the Libyans adrift so that they could have some help in forming a government and a government that would be stable and viable? There's no evidence that she did. I'm not talking about Benghazi now. I'm talking beyond that. After Gaddafi was killed, an effort should have been made by the West, including the United States, to try to help those people establish a viable government, and it was not done. And that would be pointed out, I think, to her discredit if, in fact, this comes up in the campaign.
What would seem to any disinterested observer as a bit of dysfunction. What does Congress do well? What do they really do well? They get it right. It works reasonably well, and people are reasonably satisfied with something that they're doing. What would you say?
You actually just saw a major example of this in Congress with what's called the doc fix, which was a problem that we had with Medicare, where doctors weren't getting correct payments. They weren't getting paid enough for the services they were providing. And this has been something that Congress has sort of kicked down the road over and over again. But now Speaker Boehner and Nancy Pelosi got together, hashed out a deal, and actually fixed this problem permanently and passed a big bipartisan plan in the House that the president praised, that Republicans supported for the most part. And so here was an example not only of a bipartisan effort that succeeded, but it was also something that wasn't necessarily time sensitive. We weren't facing a cliff, so to speak, as we've called all of these congressional crises. They just did it because it needed to be fixed at some point, and they said, why not now?
Yeah, that was really interesting. That actually could be the most significant piece of legislation that Congress passes this entire 2-year session. It's both indicative of how big of a bill that is, but it's also of how little that Congress will presumably do over the next 2 years. A rare bipartisan accord between Pelosi and Boehner. But there are other big things that they may have to do, like they have to deal with trade. Trade is a big issue that the president believes very deeply in, to open up international trade agreements, this Trans-Pacific Partnership, an agreement with 11 countries between the United States and these countries. But there is facing a lot of opposition from Democrats in Congress on that. But the House Republican leadership supports it. So this is an area where you're actually seeing bipartisan support between the White House and House Republicans, but you're seeing a division internally among Democrats, and that's what's the question about whether they can do anything. So if they do it, maybe that's another sign that Congress can actually function every once in a while.
Norm, Hillary Clinton is not new to Washington. If anybody who knows these things, she should know these things. What's really going on here?
Well, it's a hard one to say why at the time she did this, and even in the years since, there wasn't a clear recognition that this at some point would explode into a larger problem. You know, people sometimes act in ways that are narrow, parochial in their focus without thinking about it. And one of the things that's become clear, people in the Obama White House are now shaking their heads and wondering why somebody this experienced in dealing with politics and policy didn't see this coming. You know, one thing we might add here, Rob, is that a lot of the Republicans running for president are going to have a hard time using this issue. Jeb Bush, when he was governor of Florida, had a private email account and his own server, released a lot of emails as he had to under the Florida Sunshine Act, but he decided which ones to release as well. Scott Walker, the governor of Wisconsin, used a private email account for all kinds of political and official activities when he was the executive in Milwaukee. So it's not unheard of, but as David said, it's of a different order when you are Secretary of State and you're dealing with national security questions. So it's an issue that will linger, but we also ought to note that what most surveys show is that most Democrats at this point don't see this as much of an issue. It's not bringing about a larger competition for the Democratic nomination.
You know, Gary, so many people who are not normally associated with, say, the civil rights movement or race inequality, watched that video of Eric Garner, many conservatives, many Republicans, and said, this goes way over a line. You know, I can't defend this. Is this a moment that trying to find some silver lining in this dark cloud, is this a moment when perhaps some good can come out of this tragedy?
I am encouraged since the incident that we have had an outpouring of street protests across this country and around the world. That is a good thing. I would challenge, though, people who are not on the streets but are in the corporate suites to do more. Perhaps CEOs, particularly white CEOs, could take an ad out, one-page ad in the New York Times, and say, not only do we not support what happened to Eric Garner, but I want to let you know our programs of diversity within my corporation. I want to let you know how we're making capital accessible to all people. I want to let America know how we are promoting women, or promoting the idea that women should be paid equal to a man's work. And so we need more good people in high places to not only say in private that the Eric Garner case is somehow or another a travesty, but they have to put that into meaningful action by way of their capital, by way of their resources, and by way of their visibility.
You're an expert not just in government effectiveness, but also leadership. And let's talk about leadership for a few minutes. There's always the bemoaning, where are the Lincolns, where are the Roosevelts? Right. How would you, in general, rate the level of leadership in American politics today?
I think it's been poorer than I've seen in my lifetime.
It's poorer today.
Poorer today, yeah. I mean, on the congressional side, I do get the sense that people like Speaker Boehner have been unduly influenced by a small minority of his caucus. In other words, rather than him controlling his group, a small group inside of his Republican Party seems to be controlling him. And I think that may be changing, by the way. There's some signs. He threw 2 people off the Rules Committee last week who challenged him. There may be some change, but I thought, looking at his first couple years as leader, that he really wasn't up to the job. And I think, of course, it takes 2 to tango I shouldn't say that. It takes 2 people to get into a dysfunctional relationship. And you had this speaker who couldn't control his own party, and then he's paired with the president who has no interest in the personal side of politics. And so President Obama has not been very good at understanding the Republicans, understanding the pressures within their caucus, understanding the threat that the Tea Party posed to him. So I think it's been kind of a group of people, we've had a group of people in the last couple of years who really weren't as good as some of their predecessors were at making the system work. They were good in terms of articulating what they believed in. I'm a Democrat, so I like Obama's policies, etc. But there's been a feeling in Washington that this particular group of leaders can't make things happen. And I think that's too bad.
In a certain irony, I can imagine from your remarks that in 2016, the American people face a choice between a very well-known traditional Democrat, Hillary Clinton, been around for 30 years, and a brand new Republican face.
Probably, but I think there's hope for Jeb Bush. It may be that history will repeat itself, and the most reasonable or most electable of the Republican candidates will get nominated. And Jeb Bush is a reformer. He's an education reformer. He's an immigration reformer. And now, how he gets through this primary process, I do not know. I cannot write the scenario for you. But it's happened before, and it could happen again.
Oh my, Clinton Bush. We could just
yes, exactly.
Take our old shows and rerun them again.
Right, right.
And in that scenario, do you see Jeb Bush beating Hillary Clinton?
Well, on the basis that history shows that unpopular presidents are not succeeded by candidates of their own party, yeah. I mean, there's a chance. I mean, and Jeb Bush is a very reasonable person and very ideas oriented, And if his name weren't Bush, he'd be in great shape.
All right, you heard it here first. Bush in 2016. And in your experience, to what extent do candidates listen to very smart people like you?
Well, to some extent. That's, a good candidate will have a variety of advisors and will listen to them and then make their own decisions. And many times the advisors won't agree. But the best thing that I have to offer any candidate or campaign is that I have all this experience. I've been through all these campaigns, and I have some sense of what will work and what won't, which things are the most important in a campaign and which are less important. And so without ever trying to advise the candidate on policy or substance, I can help them a lot with the process and how best to navigate this circuitous process of primaries.
So what is a golden gem, a nugget of advice that you would give any candidate right now?
Well, right now I would tell them raise a lot of money and don't spend much of it. Because sometimes a campaign will gear up and hire a lot of staff and field people in 10, 12, 15 states, and that's not what they need right now. They're going to need that money for communication, for mass communication, in the last quarter of this year and the first quarter of next year during the primary and caucus events. So it's a hard thing to get some campaigns to have that fiscal discipline, but that's what they need to do, is spend their time raising money and saving.
So we've heard immigration, values, some economic issues, but generally not the same splits at all as among the Democrats. What about on foreign policy? Do you,
well, foreign
do you
policy,
see foreign policy divisions?
is significant in the sense that there's always a challenge when candidates are running as to how loyal they have to be to decisions taken under predecessors' watch, particularly other Republicans. So the Iraq War, whether it was a good war or a bad war, a just war or an unjust war, has become a dividing line. And Rand Paul, who many people see as an isolationist, I see Rand Paul as really reaching for an interesting space that hasn't been addressed much, which is the realist, pragmatic realm of foreign policy. He has spoken for what is called the Center for the National Interest, what was used to be known as the Nixon Center, several times, saying, I oppose neoconservatism, I oppose isolationism, I'm a pragmatic realist when it comes to foreign policy. And looking at the Iraq War, there's no way to say that that wasn't a mistake. And he, in recent interviews, has blamed factions of the Republican Party for the creation of ISIS, which is a very provocative statement and a complicated. So that has become a very big dividing line.
I want to just offer one caveat here, Rob. We don't want to make it sound as if the Republicans are all united in one big happy family,
right,
and it's the Democrats who are fractious. What's happened on the Republican side is that the struggle between the more pragmatic conservative wing, there used to be a progressive wing, it's completely gone now, but the pragmatic conservative wing and the radical Tea Party wing, where the pragmatic wing brought in that Tea Party anger to big victories in congressional elections in 2010 and 2014, and then thought they could co-opt the radicals. They've been co-opted. The unity on the Republican side is because they've all moved towards a more radical position. They will, things that they used to be for, they now denounce because the activist wing dominates. On foreign policy, it's a little bit different, and I think Steve is right, but what's happened here is that Republican candidates have found themselves in a little bit of a box. They want to portray Barack Obama as weak and feckless in foreign policy. The thing that unites Republicans more than anything else is an antipathy towards Obama and all of his policies. But what that means is they now have to cope with embracing a very unpopular war in Iraq, which most of them are doing. They're finding themselves agreeing with George Bush in a way that they really didn't particularly want to, but also attacking Obama for not going after ISIS, which puts them in a position of having to answer what they would do in a different fashion, which almost inevitably means Well, that would mean boots on the ground, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it mean more American troops abroad, which is unpopular even among Republicans?
Let me add one interesting element. My family originally comes from a place called Bartlesville, Oklahoma. It's about 35 miles north of Tulsa. It's a very, very conservative place, and I go in to check in now and then. And if you go in and ask them what animates their politics, many of the people look at many of the Republican candidates, most recently Chris Christie, as betraying the core values of conservatism, which is animated by wanting to have a government that doesn't spend much and not allowing Big Brother or spying and the invasion of American liberties to take over. So what many of us in the pundit class look at Republicans as Pentagon huggers, people that want to give the Pentagon more and more money, who want to go fight more and more wars, and like Chris Christie just said, is to give the National Security Agency all of the powers to have unfettered control to protect America. These really drive a significant number of conservatives crazy, and that is one of the significant dividing lines you'll see animate the politics within the GOP.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول الأفكار التي سمعتموها لحل مشكلات واشنطن، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.